should that be? Ahoy! Today we are diving into the depths, almost literally, of a Games Workshop legend. So, anybody who saw my last video may know that I recently came across some long-lost, forgotten treasure. At least in terms of long lost in the depths of my shed. But today we are talking about a much bigger treasure. This feels almost like it should be hidden on the back of, like, I don't know, the Bugman's menu or something. You don't have to break into the Games Workshop museum and decipher something on the back of the original RTOP01 box in order to get to the heart of this. But you don't. Instead, you just have to bear with me as we go back over 20 years ago to the heady days of the late millennium when I was a nimble beardling and Games Workshop staffer, and I heard this story for the first time. So, here we go. Way back in the early 2000s, I was working for Games Workshop, and I heard over many beers down the pub one night the story of a lost cargo of Games Workshop Land Raiders that had been lost somewhere off the coast of Cornwall. And late into the night, many drinks into our cups, myself and some colleagues debated getting our paddy qualifications and going diving to see if we could recover ourselves some classic Land Raidery goodness. This then left my memory for the last couple of decades until, as I say, I was in the process of cleaning up some lost treasures, and it got me thinking about that story, about those lost Land Raiders oh so many years ago. So I decided to do some digging. First thing I did was put a shout out to some of my Games Workshop colleagues, thanks to Nick Davis, friend of the channel, who didn't have any help to add on this, but did at least point me in the right direction. From there, I have then probed the ex-Games Workshop staff Facebook group, and that is where I hit pay dirt. And I'm going to say a big thank you to them now, and some specific thanks to them later on. So, the story as I remember it is this. There was a cargo ship that was travelling off the south coast of England somewhere when a large wave hit it, and a shipping container went over the side, and contained within that shipping container was North America's consignment of the now quite venerable, plastic Land Raider kit. This got me thinking, okay, so if it really is there, if it's somewhere in a shipping container, as long as it's not thousands and thousands of metres deep, if it's somewhere off the coast of southern England, how great would it be if you could actually go and recover some of it? Plastic, it would seem, unfortunately, lives forever in the ocean. So I started probing further, and first thing I came across was that a lot of people remembered this story, which was good. It means it wasn't something like the Mandela effect that had just occurred in my head. But there was some disagreement as to when it had happened. I thought it was the early 2000s. I thought it was maybe 2001, 2002, but a lot of the older staffers that I'd spoken to said it was much earlier. 1995, 1996, 1997 were all years that got tossed around. So this required some research. Luckily, the internet is a vast place full of useless information, and from there I was able to get a list of shipwrecks that occurred off the south coast of England. And that is where I hit what I first thought was pay dirt. So, February 1997, the shipping container transport Tokyo Express hit a freak wave off the coast of Cornwall, and a quantity of containers, 62 containers in fact, were washed overboard. This, it would seem, absolutely matched the story that I remember hearing all those years ago in the pub when we'd had a few too many beers. But 1997, that didn't seem quite right, and I couldn't quite figure out why, until I remembered something else. The plastic Land Raider kit, as I remember it, wasn't released until the year 2000, so that didn't quite jar with my memory of the legend in this case. Beyond that, some further probing turned out that the Tokyo Express was in fact a red herring. Although, as I say, 62 containers were washed over the side of the ship was damaged, had to put it into Southampton for repairs. Tokyo Express is famous for one other major reason, and anybody who lives down on the Devon and Cornwall coast will know this. It's because one of the containers contained nearly 4.8 million Lego bricks. And those Lego bricks have even still today begun washing up on beaches around the Cornwall in particular. Even as early as last year, beachcombers were happily sifting through the sand and pulling up various Lego bricks, and particularly quite amusingly various diving-themed Lego bricks like divers' flippers and plastic octopods. But they've even washed up as far afield as the Caribbean, the South American coastline. Lego bricks from that consignment have travelled the ocean current somewhat depressingly all over the world, and it would seem are still pretty much undamaged, unscathed by their time spent in the sea. But this did not help me tracking down the truth of what had happened to my legend, which I began to imagine, perhaps, about a consignment of Games Workshop product that had been lost at sea. That's when the bold souls at the ex-Games Workshop staffers Facebook group came to my rescue. Yes, it would seem that 1997 there had indeed been a consignment of Games Workshop product bound for North America that had been lost at sea. But it wasn't the venerable plastic Land Raider, it was another, and somewhat fitting kit, given what I found in my lost treasure trove in the shed last weekend. It was the plastic Eldar Falcon Grav Tank. I found 2 of these in the box that was buried at the bottom of my shed, but it would seem that over 2,000 of them were lost at sea in November 1997. And here now is the true story of a lost Games Workshop treasure trove. So, way back on the 24th of November 1997, on a ship known as the MSC Carla, maritime shipping company Carla, a cargo transport laden with shipping containers, departed for Boston. And one of those shipping containers contained the entire North American consignment of the, at the time, brand spanking new Eldar Falcon Grav Tank. Not only that, apparently it also contained a quantity of staff bonus packages, checks and so forth, to transfer funds to the American staff, but also, crucially, one of the only 250 ever cast lead Thunderhawk gunships in wooden display case. This vessel, on the 24th of November 1997, whilst crossing the Atlantic, was struck by a storm whilst bound for Boston. And there, in 70-mile-per-hour winds, with 11-metre-high seas, at approximately 6 o'clock at night, it lost all engine control. The crew battled for half an hour to try and get some form of life out of the vessel, until finally, one of the 3 engines was reignited and the vessel began again ploughing through these heavy seas. The reports from the surviving crew, it's worth saying all the crew in fact survived, that makes it sound overly dramatic. The reports from the crew, but in particular the navigator on board at that time, is that at 6:30 p.m. in the midst of the storm, the ship crested a massive wave, crashed back down again, and then, as it began to rise over a second, he realised, to his horror, that the bow light was no longer in the position that it was supposed to have been in. Instead, the ship had sheared in half amidships. Luckily, the navigator was able to spin the helm and steer the stern section that was still under power to starboard such that it was able to miss colliding with its now separated bow section. Because of the way in which the ships were designed, the stern section was able to remain afloat while a mayday was broadcast, and all 34 members of the crew were evacuated. In time, the stern section and the surviving cargo containers aboard it were towed back to Tenerife in the Canary Islands, there to be unloaded. The ship itself then sold on for scrap, but the bow section, now it's the bow section we need to concern ourselves with. The bow section of this vessel began to sink. There is a series of photos taken over a course of 5 days, which I'm sharing with you now, which show the bow section slowly foundering, tipping, almost Titanic-like, nose down, until eventually those cargo containers stored upon the decks tipped into the ocean and themselves sank beneath the waves. None of them, it was ruled, were recoverable. Amongst the cargo that was lost on this vessel were 1,600 cases of sherry, 200 cases of cognac, and dozens of cases of expensive Armagnac, some of them dating back to 1934, going at $700 a bottle. But for our interests, perhaps most crucially, amongst those 74 containers contained in the bow section of the MSC Carla was one container from Games Workshop. Contained within that, 2,000 product consignments of the plastic, brand new at the time, plastic Falcon Grav Tank, and one lead Thunderhawk gunship destined for the American studio. That container was lost at sea, approximately 200 miles northeast of the Azores in 3 kilometres of water. To put that in context, that's nearly 1.8 miles in depth. But, as we've noted from the Lego already, plastic pretty much imperishable at sea. It takes approximately 450 years for plastic to biodegrade in seawater, which is itself a quite depressing statistic given the state of our oceans. But what that means is there are still those 2,000 Thunderhawk gunships, even if the cardboard boxes have long since decayed away. 2,000 Thunderhawk plastic Falcon grav tanks. And, most importantly, that 1 in 250 lead Thunderhawk gunship lying still at the bottom of the Atlantic in nearly 2 miles of water. Unrecoverable, you would think. Well, it did ponder me to see if I could get myself essentially a very powerful magnet and 3 kilometres worth of heavy-duty wire and just start pulling up containers and see how I do. However, there is a sting in the tail to this that perhaps means that those items are lost forever, or at least lost for the next 1,000 years or so. Because amongst the other items of cargo that were aboard the MSC Carlo when its bow section went down was one container containing 3 devices destined for American hospitals. Contained within those devices was a large quantity of cesium-137, a heavily radioactive isotope used in X-rays, but also contained within these devices in such a way that apparently the French Nuclear Regulatory Authority documents that I have read state that the containers were designed to implode at any depth below 2,000 metres. Meaning that the entirety of the cargo, that Thunderhawk gunship, those plastic Falcons, may well still be lying at the bottom of the ocean's bed. But they are now heavily radioactive. As such, I think I'll stick with the Falcon gunship I've got here. But I hope that you found this as fascinating a piece of Games Workshop lore as I did. I love the random crazy factoids you can find out about Games Workshop, and delving into this one was an absolute pleasure. I'm going to throw up a map for anybody who decides they want to risk radiation poisoning and, you know, charter a submarine and just go diving for that 1 in 250 Thunderhawk. The story from the American studio staff I spoke to, by the way, is that Games Workshop HQ did eventually send a replacement to the US studio, but in the intervening time, the head of the US studio had to put up with his colleagues occasionally dropping a lead epic scale Thunderhawk gunship into his drinking water whenever he wasn't looking. The ship can be found 40 degrees 3 minutes north and 22 degrees 50 minutes west on this chart, as I've demonstrated here, on the seabed. As I've said, it lies in what they are approximating to be 3,000 metres of water. The seabed is so deep there and kind of tumultuous up and down that you can't say for definite that is the approximate depth that I've gotten from the hydrological charts. But I hope you've enjoyed this crazy piece of lore, Games Workshop lore. I worked out 2,000 products back in 1997 at £17 is not that much, but if you feed it into an inflation calculator, it comes to £34 now, which is interestingly less than the £37.50 that Games Workshop charge for a Falcon gunship now. What that means is if you take the current price of £37.50 for the Falcon grav tank, then there is £75,000 worth of Games Workshop stock sat on the seabed. Obviously, it was somewhat less in 1997, albeit the price is comparable. And that doesn't even take into account the sheer 1 in 250, not one of a kind, but 1 in 250 nature of that lead Thunderhawk gunship. I want to say some quick thank yous. Like I said, thank you to everybody. Thanks to Nick Davis for not being that much help, but pointing me in the right direction. Thank you to everybody in the X Games Workshop staff of Facebook group who indulged me when I came up with this mad query on what turned out to be April Fool's Day, and initially some of them thought I was just messing with them. But in particular, thanks go to Andy Shepherd, Alison Lister, Ian Compton and Jim Kitchen, who had the truth on this legend. If there's any other crazy pieces of Games Workshop lore or legend that you perhaps remember or you want me to investigate, please let me know in the comments below, because I had an absolute blast digging into this one. In the meantime though, thank you very much for watching this video, and as ever, I will catch you next time. Bye for now!